The crying had not stopped in 11 days. Not slowed. Not softened. Not paused for longer than a few broken minutes in the dark before it climbed back up and filled every corner of that mansion like something alive. 11 days. And Demarion Voss. A man who moved shipping contracts worth 9 figures before noon. A man who controlled port access across 11 eastern seaboard cities. A man whose name alone cleared rooms and rerouted decisions before he ever opened his mouth. Stood outside a nursery door at 2:47 in the morning with his hands loose at his sides and his jaw locked so tight his back teeth ached.
Doing absolutely nothing. Because nothing worked. This was a story about power unraveling in the smallest room of the house. Demarion had built his empire on one principle. That every problem had a solution if you applied the right pressure in the right place at the right time. Logistics was not a mystery to him. It was a language. Shipments that went missing found their way home. Supply chains that collapsed rebuilt themselves under his direction. Agreements that looked dead on paper came back to life in rooms where he sat at the table. He had always believed, not arrogantly, but practically, the way a surgeon believes in the reliability of a scalpel. That control was a skill, and he had mastered it. The twins were 4 months old. They were not interested in his skill set. He had flown in 4 specialists in the first week alone. A pediatric neurologist who arrived in a private car and left in a taxi 48 hours later, visibly shaken and professionally evasive. A developmental Omega Care consultant who charged $4,000 a day and spent most of it on the phone with her own office. A sensory therapist from Boston who lasted 3 days before citing a family emergency that Demarion's assistant later confirmed was not a family emergency. And a fourth. A sleep specialist from London whose credentials were impeccable and whose patients lasted exactly 6 days before she submitted a report and disappeared. The report said, in measured clinical language, what everyone in the mansion had been feeling in their bodies since day 3. The twins were inconsolable, the cause was unclear, and further observation was recommended.
Further observation. Demarion had paid $60,000 in specialist fees to be told to keep watching. Hi viewers. Have you ever watched someone who seems completely untouchable suddenly have no idea what to do? Someone powerful, in control of everything, except the one thing that mattered most? Tell me in the comments, because that is exactly where this story starts. The mansion sat on the upper edge of a private block in Manhattan. 11,000 square feet of marble, glass, and carefully managed silence. It had been designed for a particular kind of life. One that moved fast during the day and went completely still at night. Security on every floor. Staff rotations every 12 hours. A climate system that adjusted room temperature by zone, down to the decimal. Everything in that building was calibrated and controlled. Except the nursery on the 3rd floor. The nursery smelled like metal. Not blood. Nothing that direct. But that sharp, wire-pulled-tight chemical smell that Omega biology registers before the thinking brain catches up to it. The scent of an alpha environment under stress. Every time Demarion walked through the front door after a meeting, the air on the 3rd floor changed before he ever climbed the stairs. His pheromone output, the chemical signature every alpha carried without conscious effort, moved through the house ahead of him like a signal, and the twins picked it up before he appeared. 3 housekeepers had quit in the first 2 weeks. Demarion hadn't noticed until the second one was already replaced. His assistant Brecken had stopped delivering morning briefings in person and started leaving them on a tray outside the nursery. Not because anyone told him to, but because standing in that hallway while the crying went on was the kind of thing that got under your skin and stayed there. The overnight nurse on rotation had started wearing noise-reducing earbuds on the job. Demarion had seen this and said nothing because he understood it and didn't have a better answer. He pushed open the nursery door at 2:47 a.m. The twins. Both Omega, both 4 months old, both small enough that he was still slightly afraid every time he lifted them wrong, escalated immediately. Not gradually. Not with a warning register of discomfort that built toward distress. The moment his scent crossed the threshold, the volume jumped like something physical had shifted in the room. Pressure change. A door thrown open in a sealed space. He stepped back into the hallway. 14 seconds of relative quiet. He waited, counted, stepped forward again. The crying sharpened like a blade finding an edge. Demarion stood there, half in and half out of his own nursery, the most powerful man in 4 zip codes, and did the one thing he never did in any other room of his life. He stood still, and he did not know what to do. He pressed his hand flat against the door frame, not holding himself up, just grounding himself. Just making contact with something solid while the sound of his own children refusing him filled the air around his head. He stayed there for 4 minutes. Then he stepped back, pulled the door to, and turned around in the hallway. The figure standing at the far end of the corridor had not moved. Pressed into the shadow beside the linen closet. Back straight. A small notebook open in his left hand. A pen in his right. Dark eyes moving between the door and a grid of numbers on the page. Demarion stared at him. The figure looked up, met his eyes briefly, and made no move to explain his presence or apologize for it. He simply held the eye contact for 2 full seconds and then returned his attention to the notebook. New staff. Omega. Mute per the placement file Brecken had summarized. Hired 9 days ago through a discreet Omega domestic placement firm that specialized in high-security household environments. Name on the file, Soren Vale. Overnight duties. Laundry management, light meal prep, perimeter assistance. Not nursery observation. Demarion looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the notebook. Then he turned and walked to his own room because he had a board call in 4 hours and he was not going to solve this in the hallway at 3 in the morning. But as he walked away, one thought moved through him that he could not shake. The man at the end of the hall was on page 4. In 9 days. Page 4. Someone had been watching this whole thing very carefully. And it was not any of the $60,000 specialists. The next morning, Demarion found a single sheet of paper slipped under his office door. No name on it. No note. Just a grid, timestamps in one column, cry intensity ratings in another, personnel logged in the prior hour in a third. Clean handwriting. Tight rows. At the bottom, one line had been circled in pencil. For crying spikes, no alpha entry. Same prior hour variable each time. The variable had a name. Demarion read the name, set the paper down, picked it up again, and for the first time in 11 days, something in his chest moved that wasn't helplessness. It was sharper than that, colder. The specific feeling of a man who had just realized that the problem in his house was not a mystery. It was a message, and someone had been sent to decode it. Soren wrote the time in the margin first. Always the time. 2:51 a.m. alpha entry. Duration, 22 seconds. Cry intensity, peak register. Exit. Reduction, partial. Recovery window, 14 seconds before re-escalation. Then he underlined one word, pattern. He had started the log on his second day, not because anyone asked and not because it had anything to do with laundry or meal prep. He had started it because he walked past the nursery on his first overnight and heard a sound that didn't match the narrative being told about it. Everyone in the household was treating the crying like a mystery. Something random, something biological, something that defied explanation. But Soren had spent enough time around infant Omega care to know that inconsolable was almost never random. Inconsolable had a source. You just had to be willing to look for it past the obvious.
He looked. By day 3, he had 6 pages. By day 6, he had a preliminary map. By day 9, the night Demarion had caught him in the hallway, he had something close to a theory. He just wasn't ready to call it that yet. Soren Vale was 31 years old and had been selectively nonverbal since the age of 15. Not because of trauma in the melodramatic sense. No single catastrophic event that had stolen his voice. Something more precise than that. At 15, he had testified in a custody proceeding involving a family member. He had spoken clearly, accurately, without embellishment. He had described what he saw with the kind of directness that adults usually praised in children until it became inconvenient. And he had watched his words enter that courtroom and come out the other side as something he did not recognize. Reframed, recontextualized, reassign meaning until the testimony that left his mouth bore almost no relationship to the ruling it helped produce. He had learned something that day that most people spent their whole lives avoiding, that spoken words in adversarial spaces were raw material. They could be used in any direction, and he had made a decision, slowly and without drama, to stop handing that material to rooms that would reshape it. He communicated in writing when writing was necessary, in gesture when gesture was sufficient, and in the kind of focused, load-bearing silence that most people read as absence, and that was, in practice, the sharpest observational tool he had ever developed.
The placement firm had listed him as nonverbal on the intake form. The household coordinator had read this as a limitation and scheduled him for overnight shifts, where communication demands were lowest. This was, from Soren's perspective, perfect. Overnight shifts meant access to the whole house in its unguarded state. People did not perform for an audience they believed was not watching. Soren was always watching. His background in neonatal sensory work was not on the application. That chapter had lived in a developmental clinic in Philadelphia that ran for 2 years on grant funding before the grant structure collapsed and the clinic closed. Soren had worked there alongside a team that specialized in omega infant biology, specifically in the intersection of environmental chemistry and behavioral response in the first year of life. He had not led anything. He had not published anything. He had sat in observation rooms and logged data and learned, over 2 years of quiet attention, how to read the difference between a baby who needed comfort and a baby who was responding to a chemical signal they had no vocabulary to name. The twins were responding to a chemical signal they had no vocabulary to name. He was increasingly certain of this. Omega infants in the first 6 months operated primarily on a sensory register that adult biology had largely moved past. Their threat detection system, the biological machinery that read dominant alpha pheromone output as either safe or unsafe, was functioning at full sensitivity with none of the contextual filtering that came with age and experience. They couldn't read Demarion's face and know he was their father and feel safe. They could only read his chemical signature and respond to what it told them. And what it was telling them, apparently, was that the dominant alpha in their environment was in sustained distress. This was the part that didn't fit. Demarion Voss was not a distressed man. He was the most externally regulated person Soren had observed in close quarters in years. His effect was controlled. His movements were deliberate. His voice, on the rare occasions Soren heard it through a door or at the end of a hallway, carried the even cadence of someone who had spent decades choosing each word before releasing it. His pheromone output should have registered as stable. The kind of steady, grounded alpha signature that infant omegas typically oriented toward, not away from. But they were running from it. Both of them. Every time. So either Demarion was concealing a level of internal instability that his external presentation completely masked, which was possible, but which didn't explain the spikes on days when he didn't enter the nursery at all, or the signal the twins were reading was not coming from him. It was being placed in the room. Soren sat with this conclusion for 2 full days before he wrote it down, because writing it down meant committing to it, and he did not commit to conclusions he had not fully built. He turned it over. He checked his data from every angle he could access. He pulled the ventilation layout from the building upgrade documentation that had been filed in the household record system, which he had access to because his overnight duties technically included HVAC filter monitoring, a detail the household coordinator had included almost as an afterthought. The east wall of the nursery had a primary ventilation return, pulled air through the room continuously, which meant anything introduced near that panel would distribute through the entire space within minutes and remain at trace levels for hours. You would not smell it. You would not see it. The infants would not know what was happening to them. They would only know something was wrong. Soren reviewed the access logs again. The 3 daytime spikes, no alpha entry, and the shared prior hour variable. He thought about what it would take to place something near that panel. 6 minutes, maybe less, if you knew what you were doing. If you were comfortable in the space. If you had reason to be there that no one would question. Then he pulled the security footage archive. The archive was accessible through the same monitoring terminal he used for overnight perimeter checks. He had not been told it was available to him. He had also not been told it wasn't. He pulled it and looked. 2:13 a.m. The nursery door opened. The motion-sensitive overhead in the hallway logged the entry without triggering any alert, because this person was on the approved entry list. Cleared staff. Authorized access. No alarm, no flag, no record in the morning household log. Because whoever managed the morning household log had not included this person's 2:13 a.m. visit. Soren looked at the face in the footage. Looked at the name in the access entry log. Looked at his notebook. He wrote the name down for the first time. Slowly. Deliberately. Not in the margin, in the center of a clean page with a box around it. Vittorio Hale. And underneath, in smaller letters, why at 2:13? What needed doing at 2:13 that could not have waited for morning? He closed the notebook and sat in the utility room in the dark for a while. Then he went back to the footage and watched it 6 more times. Because the thing about patterns was that once you saw one, you couldn't unsee it. And the thing about evidence was that it only spoke to you in the language of accumulation, one piece at a time, each one unlocking the next, until the shape of the whole thing became something you could not argue yourself out of. He was not at the arguing stage yet, but he was getting close. The port contracts were the architecture beneath everything. Not the money was a symptom, not a structure. The real mechanism was access, and access was what Demarion Voss had spent 15 years building into something that couldn't be removed without dismantling everything around it. 11 ports along the eastern seaboard where his logistics network was embedded so completely that the ports themselves had begun to function as extensions of the Voss infrastructure. The personnel who moved cargo through those facilities trained in Voss procedures. The software that tracked manifests ran on Voss-licensed platforms. The contracts that governed scheduling, priority access, and dispute resolution had been written, over a decade of patient legal work, with clauses that made extraction prohibitively expensive. Pulling Demarion out of those ports would not be a hostile takeover. It would be surgery on a living body. Painful, slow, and with no guarantee the body survived. 3 rival alpha families knew this. And 2 weeks ago they had all sat in the same room. Demarion had called the summit himself, which was a move that confused people who didn't understand how he operated. You didn't invite your rivals to the table to demonstrate weakness. You invited them to demonstrate that you controlled the table. The dinner had taken place in a private floor of a midtown building that Demarion owned outright, served by staff who signed non-disclosure agreements before they were hired, in a room where the only recording devices were ones Demarion had installed himself and could confirm were running only the feeds he chose. For men, 2 bottles of wine that no one finished. 3 hours of conversation that covered, in careful language, the future of port access negotiations, the upcoming Senate contracts, and the unspoken but fully understood question of whether the current territorial arrangement would hold for another 5 years. The conversation had been civil, productive even by the measure of what these conversations usually produced. No agreements were signed. Nothing was committed to paper, but everyone left understanding the same thing. The current structure held because Demarion held it. And Demarion held it because no one had yet calculated what they gained from ending it. The twins had begun crying that same night. Soren had not been at the summit. He had been hired the morning before it, a timing detail that Demarion had not flagged until later, when the timing of several other things also began to require re-examination. What Soren was focused on now was the biology of the situation. Specifically, the documented intersection between omega infant stress response and the chemistry of alpha pheromone disruption. He had 3 research papers spread across the utility room table, printed from public academic databases during an overnight hour when the house was quiet. The first 2 were peer-reviewed, published in developmental biology journals, describing the mechanism by which omega infants in the first 6 months registered dominant alpha chemical output as environmental safety signals. When the alpha's chemistry was stable, the infant's regulatory system stayed calm. When the alpha's chemistry destabilized, through stress, threat, physical illness, psychological duress, the infant registered this before any behavioral cue was visible. The crying was not a response to anything the adult did. It was a response to what the adult's body was broadcasting without the adult's awareness or consent. The third paper was different. It came from a private research foundation whose public profile was thin and whose funding sources were listed as consortium-based, without further specification. The paper described the synthesis of compounds that could replicate dominant alpha stress hormone signatures at the chemical level. Engineered molecules that, when introduced into a controlled environment, produced a pheromone reading that registered as acute alpha distress without any actual alpha distress being present. Odorless to standard adult detection. Undetectable by conventional air quality monitoring. Biologically specific enough to activate the omega infant threat response mechanism without triggering adult alarm. Soren had read this paper 4 times. Each time, something in the back of his mind had grown quieter and colder, the way things go quiet when a shape becomes fully visible. He thought about the ventilation panel on the east wall, the 6-minute nursery visits, the 2:13 a.m. entry that no one had logged. He thought about the fact that the crying spikes, the ones that occurred without Demarion in the building, aligned with a very specific variable in the access logs. He thought about Vittorio Hale, who had worked alongside Demarion for 9 years and who therefore knew exactly what the outcome of sustained infant distress would look like in an alpha's household. Who would know what it would do to a man's standing, to his perceived fitness, to the confidence of the people around him. Power doesn't fall from outside enemies. It fractures from internal ambition. And internal ambition is always the most patient kind, because it has proximity on its side. Can wait in the same room for years. Soren put the 3rd paper down and opened the thermal imaging archive. The nursery monitoring system had a thermal camera installed for infant safety, basic protocol in high-security household setups, designed to alert staff to fever or respiratory distress. The camera fed to a primary monitor in the nursery and to a secondary archive that Soren had located on day 4 by following a data cable behind the linen shelving unit. The archive was not encrypted. It had not occurred to anyone to encrypt it, because it had not occurred to anyone that someone would both find it and know what to look for inside it. He queued up the footage from both of Vittorio's daytime nursery visits. The logs showed each visit lasting under 6 minutes. Each logged as a wellness check, a designation available to senior household staff, requiring no additional authorization. On the thermal feed, both visits followed an identical pattern. Vittorio entered, moved briefly toward the cribs, spent the first 90 seconds in observable proximity to the infants, enough to constitute the wellness framing, then moved to the east wall, crouched near the ventilation return, remained there for approximately 2 to 3 minutes, then stood, straightened his jacket, and left. In both instances, the thermal imaging captured a slight temperature variance near the vent panel in the minutes immediately following. Consistent with aerosol dispersal. Consistent with the introduction of a compound at or near room temperature that was not present before the visit began. Soren sat very still. He had a theory he could no longer call a theory. He thought about what to do with this. He thought about it with the same careful, unhurried patience he brought to everything. Not because he was uncertain, but because the difference between evidence and accusation was the difference between something that could reshape a situation and something that could be dismissed the moment it was convenient. He was not going to hand this to the wrong person. He was not going to write it in a note that could be intercepted. He was not going to speak it aloud in a space he did not control. He needed a sample, something physical, something the building's own chemistry could not produce on its own. He stood up, closed his notebook, and walked to the utility room supply cabinet. He found a sealed evidence collection bag, the kind stocked in high-security household environments as standard protocol, though rarely used for anything beyond spill documentation. He held it in his hand for a moment. Then he went upstairs to the nursery, moved directly to the east wall, opened the ventilation panel access cover with a flathead from the utility kit in his pocket, swabbed the interior surface of the return duct with the collection strip, sealed the bag, logged the time and location on the outside in his small, precise handwriting. He placed the sealed bag in the center of the nursery table. He stepped back. He looked at what he'd built, the log pages, the thermal captures, the access records, and felt, for the first time since arriving in this house, that the shape of the thing was fully visible. Now someone else needed to see it, and he had one person in mind. The boots hit the marble at the end of the hallway, and Soren heard them from inside the nursery before the footsteps had covered half the distance. Heavy, deliberate, the rhythm of a man who had never once in his adult life walked into a room uncertain of whether he had the right to be there. Demarion Voss did not pace himself to a room. He arrived at it. There was a difference, and Soren registered it in the tension change that moved through his own body as the sound grew louder and the door at the end of the corridor swung open without a knock. Two security detail behind him, both larger than most of the men Soren had ever stood near. Both professional, eyes already scanning the room before Demarion's shoulders had cleared the doorframe. The kind of security that moved ahead of its principal's awareness and finished the threat assessment before the principal had to think about it. Demarion himself was in dark clothing, not the full suit of a man who had prepared himself for this confrontation, which told Soren this had been a decision made quickly, not a scheduled event. His jaw was set. His eyes moved directly to Soren and did not move off him. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had made a decision and arrived to finalize it. The information he had been given, whoever had given it, was that the new Omega Maid had been observed near the nursery multiple times outside of his assigned hours. Which was true. Which was also, from every angle Soren had considered, the most easily misread truth in the building. Soren did not move back. Did not reach for anything. Did not look away. He had prepared the table before the boots were halfway down the corridor. 40 seconds of lead time was enough, if you knew what needed to be communicated and you had already decided how to do it. The folder was open, pages laid flat, organized left to right in the sequence of their logical weight. Timestamps on the left, the personnel correlation grid in the center, the thermal captures on the right. And at the top right corner, sitting slightly apart from everything else as its own statement, the sealed evidence bag. Demarion stopped 2 feet inside the door. The twins registered his scent before his shadow crossed the threshold. Both of them, simultaneously, with the precision that had been documented now across 17 separate entries in Soren's log. The crying sharpened. Both infants, full register, the specific high-frequency pitch that had been the defining acoustic feature of this household for 11 days running. Demarion's eyes moved briefly to the cribs. Something in his face did what faces do when the wound is in the same place as the power. It locked down harder. Not cruelty. The opposite of cruelty. The specific containment of a person who refuses to let anyone see how much something costs them. He took 2 steps toward Soren. The crying escalated. One of the security detail moved forward. Demarion raised a hand without looking. A gesture so practiced it had no thought in it, and the man stopped. Soren turned the folder so it faced the room. He pointed to the timestamp column on the left side of the first page. Slow, deliberate. One finger moving down the dates. Then he shifted his finger to the parallel column, the one tracking the 4 crying spikes that had occurred on days with no alpha entry recorded. He let Demarion look. Silence except for the twins. Then Soren moved his finger to the name. Once. Not a stab at the page, a placement. Deliberate and still, the way you set something down that you want someone to pick up with full attention. Vittorio Hale. Circled in pencil. 3 instances in the prior hour column across the 4 anomalous spike days. Demarion looked at the name for a long time. Then Soren moved to the thermal captures. Slid them forward. The east wall. The ventilation panel. The figure crouched near the return duct, twice on separate dates at the same location, for the same duration. The room breathed. Soren pointed last to the evidence bag. Just pointed. Did not pick it up. Did not gesture toward the lab or explain what a swab from a ventilation duct might contain. If this man needed that explained, the evidence wasn't the problem, the audience was. Demarion picked up the bag himself. Turned it over in his hands slowly. Looked at the handwritten notation on the outside: location, timestamp, collection method. He turned it once more, set it back on the table, and looked at the grid of timestamps again. His eyes moved across the page in the precise, scanning pattern of someone who read data for a living and was now reading data that implicated his own household. Then Demarion took 1 step backward. Not intentional, the body making a decision the mind hadn't finished yet. The crying dropped a register. Fractional. Almost nothing. But Soren had been logging tenths of registers for 9 days and he heard it. Another step back. It dropped again. Demarion stood at the threshold of his own nursery, half his body in the hallway, the rest of him still inside, and looked at his children from a distance for a long, suspended moment. The kind of looking that doesn't have a name because most people don't let themselves do it in front of witnesses. What hurt most wasn't the accusation. It was how easily goodness is doubted when it comes from someone small, and how much it costs the person being doubted to keep standing there anyway, without defense and without apology, and let the evidence do the work. Demarion's eyes came back to Soren. A different kind of looking this time. Not assessment. Not the scanning threat evaluation of a man who has been trained to categorize everything that moves through his space. Something slower. Something that was trying to recalibrate from the beginning. A long beat of silence. Then Demarion said, without raising his voice, without looking away from the sealed evidence bag on the table, one sentence to the man directly behind his left shoulder. Get me an independent lab. Tonight. Full chemical panel, air compound analysis, nothing filtered through the household system. The security detail was already moving before the sentence finished. Demarion picked up the evidence bag one more time, held it, set it back. He walked out of the room without another word or a backward glance. Soren stood at the nursery table and listened to the footsteps recede down the hallway. Then he sat down on the small chair beside the supply cabinet and rested his hands on his knees and breathed. The twins were still crying, but both of them had dropped to a lower register now that the alpha scent had cleared the room, and in the relative quiet of that lower register, Soren could hear something under the crying that he had not been able to hear for the past 9 days. Just two small people, afraid of something they didn't understand, wanting someone to fix it. He stayed in the room until both of them were asleep. Then he went back downstairs and opened his notebook to page 8. The lab results arrived 41 hours later, delivered to Demarion's locked office via secure courier. No household system, no internal email, no chain of custody that passed through anyone currently employed in the building. Synthetic stress hormone compounds. Engineered for olfactory bypass. Designed to register below adult human detection thresholds while producing full-spectrum activation of omega infant pheromone threat response systems. Present in the nursery air sample at 3 times the threshold concentration necessary to produce sustained behavioral distress in infants under 6 months. 3 times. Demarion read the report standing up. He did not sit down. He read it to the end. Then he turned to the first page and read it again from the beginning, slower this time, the way you reread something not because you didn't understand it but because you need to let the full weight of it settle into your body before you decide what to do. When he finished the second reading, he folded the report, placed it in the interior chest pocket of his jacket, and stood for a moment in the center of his office with his hand flat against his sternum, feeling the paper there. Then he made 2 phone calls. Private lines. No speakerphone. Both under 90 seconds. Then he sat down at his desk and opened a file that had been sitting in his locked drawer for 6 days. Since the first time he had looked at the page, Soren slid under his office door and thought, this is not a domestic problem. It never was. The compounds weren't designed to hurt anyone. That was the specific, carefully worded detail that the lab analyst had flagged in her report with a double underline. As though she understood that this distinction mattered, that the person reading it would need to sit with it before moving forward. Not lethal. Not toxic in the conventional sense. Not the kind of substance that would show up in a routine medical screening or leave any physiological mark on the children exposed to it. There would be no injury report, no hospital record, no evidence that anything harmful had ever been introduced into that room. Just 2 infants crying. And 1 alpha who looked, to every observer with access to the household, like a man who could not manage his own family. Demarion sat in the war room on the 43rd floor, a space with no windows, 1 entrance, a sound dampening system he'd had installed 3 years ago for reasons he'd never explained to anyone, and a table large enough for 12 that he was currently occupying alone, and read the analyst's notes for the 3rd time. He was not rushing. Rushing was what people did when they were reactive. Demarion had spent 15 years building an empire on the discipline of not being reactive. on waiting until the full shape of a situation was visible before deciding where to put pressure and how hard. He had watched other men in his position respond to provocation with speed and end up moving in exactly the direction their opponent had intended. He was not going to do that. He was going to sit in this room until he understood everything. The compounds required access. That was the first wall. Not to the technology existed, could be sourced through the right channels by someone with the right connections in the right research circles. But to the nursery specifically, to the ventilation system, to the household schedule that governed who was present and when. This was not an outside actor. The logistics were too precise, the timing too consistent with internal access patterns, the placement too specifically aimed at the one location in the house where the biological effect would be both maximized and impossible to trace through conventional investigation. This was someone inside, someone who knew the house, who had standing in it, who moved through it with the ease of a person whose presence was expected and whose purpose was unquestioned. The second wall was motive. And motive required understanding what was at stake. Demarion pulled a document from the locked drawer in the war room table, a copy of the internal governance structure for the Voss operational board. He turned to page 14, the section that most board members had read once, found procedurally dry, and not returned to. The removal clause. In the language of a board operating under the Voss structural agreement, a motion of leadership review could be initiated on the basis of documented evidence of sustained personal instability. Not financial mismanagement, there was a separate clause for that. Not strategic failure. Personal. The word appeared 3 times in the clause, which meant someone had put it there intentionally and expected someone else to find it useful. Personal instability, as defined in the attached exhibits, included documented breakdown of domestic management, evidence of compromised judgment in home environment, sustained reports from household staff of erratic behavior, and, specifically with its own subparagraph, inability to provide stable caregiving environment for dependents. An alpha who could not soothe his own infants. An alpha whose children cried every time he entered the room. An alpha whose staff turned over repeatedly, whose specialists came and went, whose household had become, by any external measure, a place of sustained and unresolved distress. That was the filing that had been prepared. Demarion could see the shape of it now the way you see a building from a distance, the whole structure visible before you arrive at the door. The custody petition was already in motion somewhere in a legal system Demarion had not yet identified. The board motion was 19 days out. The narrative had been building for 11 days, carefully, quietly, in a house where the only witness to the real story had been a mute Omega man with a notebook and the kind of observational patience that most people in power never think to account for. Because people in power almost never expect the quietest person in the room to be the most dangerous to their plans. Power doesn't fall from outside enemies. It fractures from internal ambition. The kind that is patient enough to share your table, attend your meetings, remember your children's birth dates, and spend 9 years learning the architecture of your trust so that when the time comes to use it against you, the foundation is already in place. Demarion set the governance document aside. He made a decision. He picked up his phone and made a call to his financial forensics team. Not the household financial team. The external forensics firm he had retained 3 years ago for a separate matter and had never had reason to use at full capacity until now. He gave them one instruction: full audit of all discretionary expenditures routed through any external consulting firm contracted in the past 24 months. No filters. No thresholds. Every line item regardless of amount. Then he put the phone down and sat with the quiet. This was the specific quiet that the people who knew Demarion Voss, who really genuinely knew him, not the board version, not the press version, not the controlled summit version, had learned over years to take seriously. Not the quiet before emotion. Not the held breath before an outburst. The quiet of a man who had moved past reaction entirely and arrived at decision. A settled, complete, final quiet that meant the analysis was done and what came next would not be loud. The forensics results came in at 11:52 p.m. One external consulting firm appeared 3 times in the expenditure record, billed at amounts that each fell just below the internal authorization threshold requiring dual signature approval. Small enough to pass through a quarterly review without triggering review protocols. large enough, when aggregated across 3 billing cycles, to fund a private research engagement of meaningful scale. The firm was registered in Delaware. Its listed business purpose was described as strategic advisory and operational consulting. Its registered agent was a name that meant nothing to Demarion. But the secondary contact, listed in the service agreement as operational lead, the name that appeared on correspondence, that signed off on deliverable confirmations, that had been entered into the vendor management system by someone with senior authorization access, was not a stranger. Vittore Hale. 9 years. Every major negotiation. Every summit. Every board meeting where the language of the governance documents had been reviewed, refined, and in some cases drafted at his recommendation. Vittore, who had access to the nursery, who had approved the building upgrade 2 years ago that documented the ventilation schematics in the household system, who had recommended the specific Omega domestic placement firm that had sent Soren Vale to the house 9 days before a summit that Vittore had helped organize. Demarion looked at the name on the page. He looked at it for a long time. He did not reach for his phone again. He did not call anyone in. He did not move toward the door or the intercom or any of the mechanisms by which a man in his position typically converted anger into action. He had felt the anger move through him like a current when the name resolved on the page, and he had let it pass through without stopping it, the way you let a current move through you when you know the ground under your feet is solid. He went quiet, and in that quiet he began to plan. Not a confrontation. Not a dramatic revelation at a board table. Not the kind of response that Vittore had almost certainly modeled for in his risk calculations. The loud, aggressive, emotionally exposed alpha who proves, by his own reaction, the narrative being built around him. Something else entirely. Something that Vittore, in 9 years of watching Demarion respond to provocation, had apparently not understood him well enough to anticipate. Because Vittore had mistaken control for predictability. And those were not the same thing. 40 miles across the city, in a building Vittore had stopped monitoring regularly because the information he needed from it had already been extracted, a security camera logged a badge access event at 11:09 p.m. The badge belonged to a record classification that should not have had after-hours access to the digital archive it had just entered. The access flag generated automatically. It routed to Demarion's compliance system at 11:14 p.m. By the time Demarion read it at 11:58 p.m. He had already begun the first of several quiet moves that Vittore would not register until it was too late to counter them. And in the nursery on the 3rd floor, the ventilation panel reinstalled, the east wall clean, the air in the room carrying only what the air was supposed to carry. The twins slept for 4 hours without waking. Nobody downstairs knew why yet. But Soren was sitting in the utility room with his notebook open to page 9, listening to the quiet of a house that was finally breathing correctly, and writing down the time. He always wrote the time first. The accounts froze on a Tuesday, not all at once, not in a way that announced itself. One at a time over the course of 4 business hours, in the quiet, procedural language of compliance holds and regulatory review flags. The kind of language that looks like paperwork until you understand what it means. Vittore Hale understood what it meant by the 3rd one. He was sitting in his office on the 31st floor when his financial assistant knocked twice and entered with the expression of someone delivering news they don't fully understand but know is bad. The first hold had come through at 9:47 a.m., the second at 11:12, the third at 1:03 p.m., each one attached to a different subsidiary. Each one initiated through a different regulatory channel. Each one carrying the same language in the notification header. Pending internal compliance review. Access suspended pending resolution. Vittore looked at the 3 notifications laid out on his desk. He did not reach for his phone. That was the tell. The people in his orbit who noticed things, and there were very few of them because Vittore had spent 9 years carefully managing who in his orbit noticed things, would have registered that as the tell. A man who had done nothing wrong reaches for his phone immediately. He calls his lawyer, his financial team, the compliance office. He asks questions in a loud voice because loud voices belong to innocent people who have nothing to protect. Vittore sat very still. He looked at the notifications for 40 seconds. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the window and looked out at the city below. The same city he had looked at from this floor for 9 years, always from a position of access. Always as a man whose standing in the room was assumed and whose authority was understood. The city looked the same, but something had shifted in the air of it. He just couldn't identify the source yet. That was the problem with a man like Demarion when he decided to move quietly. He didn't announce his direction. He didn't make the mistake of letting the target know which wall was coming down first. Vittoro had spent 9 years watching Demarion respond to external threats. Loudly, surgically, with the kind of decisive confrontation that made his position clear and his opponent's position untenable. Vittoro had built his plan around that pattern. He had expected rage. He had prepared for a confrontation in a boardroom or a private office. He had lawyers on standby. He had a counter-narrative ready. He had not prepared for nothing. Because nothing, the specific, deliberate, engineered nothing of a man choosing not to move the way his opponent expected, was the thing Vittoro had no counter for. You cannot argue against a silence. You cannot file a response to a procedural hold. You cannot call a press conference to defend yourself against an audit. You can only wait. And waiting, for a man who had spent 9 years moving inside someone else's structure, was the one posture that made the borrowed nature of his power visible. That was by design. Demarion had initiated 3 separate actions through 3 separate channels, timed with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years learning that the most effective pressure is the kind the target feels before they can name it. No direct confrontation, no board announcement, no leaked information, no visible fingerprints on any single action. Just quiet, procedural, devastating motion, the financial equivalent of removing the foundation from a building without touching the walls. The shell firm's accounts were the first layer. Those holds had gone through a federal regulatory tip, routed anonymously, through a compliance channel that Demarion's legal team had used twice before in unrelated matters. Clean, documentable, untraceable back to any personal interest. The shell firm's service agreements were the second layer. A single letter from Voss corporate counsel. Formal, courteous, and completely impenetrable, notifying the firm that its vendor status was under review pending audit findings, and that all ongoing service access was suspended effective immediately. The board inquiry was the third layer. Not a motion, not yet, a request, submitted by an independent board member who had no visible connection to Demarion and who had, in fact, been gently prompted through 2 intermediaries and a casual conversation at a private dinner 3 days prior. For a full financial disclosure from all senior executive officers in advance of the upcoming vote. Standard procedure. Completely standard. And completely lethal to a man who had 3 months of shell firm payments sitting in a disclosure he had already filed as complete. Justice that screams satisfies ego. Justice that waits reshapes systems. And the most durable kind of justice leaves the target standing long enough to understand exactly what has happened to them before the final piece falls into place. Demarion was not finished. In the nursery, the twins had slept 6 consecutive hours the previous night. The environmental destabilizers had been removed from the ventilation system. The air in the room now carried only what it was supposed to carry. The baseline chemistry of a house, warm and neutral, and without the engineered signal that had been driving 2 small children into biological panic for nearly 2 weeks. The crying had not stopped entirely. They were 4-month-old infants. They still had needs, still had discomfort, still had the ordinary distress of very young people navigating a world too large for them. But the peak register, sustained, 11-day continuous quality of it was gone. The specific sharpening that happened the moment Demarion's scent crossed the threshold was diminishing, slowly, as the ambient compound levels cleared from the room's surfaces and fabric and air, but diminishing. Soren tracked the change in his log. Not dramatically, just numbers in columns the way he tracked everything. But at the bottom of Tuesday's entry, in the margin, he wrote 2 words he did not usually write. Getting better. He looked at those 2 words for a moment. Then he closed the notebook and went to start the morning laundry. He was pulling a load from the dryer when his phone, a basic model he used only for household coordination texts, received a message from a number he did not recognize. The message contained no words, just a photograph, slightly blurred, taken from a distance with the particular quality of an image captured in haste rather than intention. The photograph showed Soren entering the nursery building through the service entrance. Time-stamped from 4 days ago. Soren looked at the image for a long time. Then he set the phone face down on the dryer and stood very still in the utility room and thought. Vittorio had suspected him, had apparently been watching him long enough to document his movements and acquire a photograph and, presumably, was now in the process of deciding what to do with it. The photograph was not evidence of wrongdoing. Soren's presence in the nursery was documented and authorized across multiple household logs. But a photograph in the right context told any story its presenter wanted it to tell. He had learned that in a courtroom at 15. He wrote the message down, logged the time, added it to the folder. Then he went to find Brecken and handed him a sealed note. The note said, in Soren's small, precise handwriting, "He knows I have something." The photograph was a warning, not an accusation. He'll move to discredit before he moves to confront. Whatever he files, with the board, with the press, with a legal firm, it will come in the next 48 hours. Brecken read it, looked at Soren, nodded once, and went directly to Demarion's office. The security intercept came in 6 hours later. Someone, using a device registered to a personal account with no direct Voss organizational affiliation, but whose IP address routed through a server associated with Vittorio's private consulting operation, had accessed the public intake portal of a legal firm specializing in domestic and family court proceedings. The access had lasted 11 minutes. A draft filing had been initiated. The subject was Soren Vale. The twins slept through the night for the first time on Wednesday. Both of them. Full night. No waking, no escalation, no peak register crying that climbed the walls and turned the third floor into a held breath. The baby monitor on Demarion's nightstand registered nothing but the soft, rhythmic audio of two small people at rest. Demarion lay awake and listened to it. Not from worry, from something he didn't have a word for yet. The specific quality of a silence you've been waiting for so long that when it finally arrives, you don't know what to do inside it. He listened until 4 a.m. and then got up and went to the war room. The custody petition arrived at 7:14 a.m. Filed anonymously through a family court intake process that accepted third-party submissions on behalf of parties who claimed standing as concerned household observers. The document was 12 pages. It cited, in precise and source language, 11 days of sustained infant distress, multiple specialist departures, high staff turnover, evidence of alpha pheromone instability in the primary caregiving environment, and a pattern of domestic disruption that, it argued, rose to the level of a fitness concern requiring court review. Every fact in it was accurate. Every fact in it was framed to mean the opposite of what it actually meant. Demarion read it twice. Then he put it down and called his lead counsel, a woman named Avery Blanchard who had been practicing family and corporate law for 22 years and who answered the phone on the second ring regardless of the hour because she had an arrangement with Demarion's office that she was compensated accordingly. He read her the opening paragraph. "Okay," she said when he finished. "Who else knows about the lab report?" "You, me, the analyst, and the person who collected the sample." "Is the person who collected the sample prepared to appear?" Demarion paused. That was the question. Soren Vale, who did not speak in courtrooms, who had built his entire adult life around the discipline of not handing words to rooms that would reshape them, who had been sent a photograph from a device connected to the man who had just filed a custody petition designed to destroy the household Soren had spent 9 days protecting. Demarion sat with the question. He had not asked Soren for anything, had not made demands, had not leveraged the position. The sensory chart, the evidence bag, the thermal captures, the access log correlations, all of it had been given freely without negotiation, placed on a table and left there for someone else to pick up or walk past. He had picked it up. Now the question was whether Soren would walk into a room that had taken something from him once before and trust that this time the architecture of the space was different. "Give me 24 hours, Demarion said. He found Soren in the utility room at 8:40 a.m. Not dramatically, no summons, no formal meeting setup, no indication that what was about to happen was significant. Demarion walked in, moved a folded towel off the chair beside the sorting table, and sat down. Soren looked at him. Demarion placed the custody petition on the table face up. Then he placed Avery Blanchard's business card beside it. Then he folded his hands on the table and said, simply and without theater, I need you to stand beside me in court, not to speak. Your logs, your thermal captures, your chemical analysis, they do the speaking. I need you present as the specialist witness who built the case. Your attorney will be Avery. She'll prepare you for everything. Nobody will ask you to say a word you don't want to say. Soren looked at the petition. Read the first page. Turn to the second. Read that too. Then he looked at Demarion. Demarion did not add anything. Did not fill the silence with reassurance or persuasion. He had made the ask. The rest belonged to Soren. Soren looked at the business card for a long time. Then he opened his notebook to a clean page and wrote, What happens to the twins if the petition is granted review? Demarion answered honestly. Temporary review proceedings. Possible supervised visitation restriction while the court assesses. Duration unknown. Soren wrote, And if we go in with the evidence? The chemical analysis alone is enough to shift the narrative. But the judge needs to understand how it was found. That requires someone who can testify to the method, who can show the court what they saw and how they logged it. Soren looked at the window for a moment. Then he turned back to the notebook and wrote one line. When is the hearing? 72 hours. He wrote, I'll be there. Demarion nodded. He picked up the business card, set it back down closer to Soren's side of the table, stood, moved toward the door. Then he stopped. He turned back. Not all the way, just enough. Why did you stay? He said. After the photograph. After whoever sent it expected you to walk. Soren picked up his pen, looked at the page, wrote 3 words. Slid the notebook across the table. They deserved steady. Demarion looked at those 3 words, looked at them for a long time. Then he walked out of the utility room and down the hall and did not stop until he reached the war room, where he stood alone for 4 minutes with his hand flat on the table and his eyes on nothing. Avery Blanchard arrived that afternoon with a team of 2 and a rolling case of files. She spent 3 hours with Soren at the dining room table, not asking him to rehearse answers but reviewing the documentation he had built, asking him to annotate unclear sections, and building a presentation architecture that let the evidence carry the weight without requiring Soren to do anything in the courtroom except exist as the person who had built it. She was, Soren noted, very good at reading silence. She never once asked him to speak. She never reached for the space between his responses and filled it with her own assumptions about what he meant. She read what he wrote, asked clarifying questions in writing when the clarification mattered, and moved on when it didn't. She treated his communication style the way a skilled professional treats any specialized working method, as the tool that works best for this person in this situation, and therefore the tool to use. No adjustment requested. No accommodation performed. Just 2 people building something together in the language that was available to both of them. Soren had not worked with many people like that. He noticed it the way you notice something rare, not with surprise because he had stopped being surprised by rarity, but with a kind of quiet registration. A filing away. She is one of the ones who gets it. He would remember that. By the time she left, the structure they had built together was clean and load-bearing. Every exhibit connected to the next. Every claim in the petition had a direct evidential counter already positioned in the sequence. The judge would not have to work to understand what had happened. The evidence would simply show her. By the time Soren went to bed that night, he had read through the full petition one more time, identified 4 factual claims that the evidence directly contradicted, and added a 5th annotation section to his log. 72 hours. He set his alarm. He slept. The courtroom was smaller than it looked in the filing documents. Family court always was. The architecture of it, the low ceiling, the plain wood paneling, the fluorescent light that was slightly too bright for the size of the room, had the effect of making everything that happened inside it feel more immediate than a larger space would allow. There was nowhere to hide from the specific gravity of what was being decided. Demarion sat at the respondent's table in a dark suit, hands flat on the surface in front of him. Avery Blanchard sat to his left with a legal pad and 3 file folders arranged in the order she would use them. Soren sat to Demarion's right, one chair removed from the table, positioned as a specialist witness. A small pedfolio open in front of him containing his annotated log and a clean copy of each exhibit. Across the aisle, the petitioner's representation was a 2-attorney team from a firm that specialized in domestic fitness proceedings. They had arrived with confidence, the particular practice confidence of lawyers who had filed this kind of petition before and knew the statistical weight of an alpha household with documented sustained infant distress and specialist turnover. The numbers almost always told a story. The numbers almost always won. They had not yet seen what Soren had built. And what Soren had built was not a defense. That was the specific quality of it that the petitioner's team had no framework for. A defense started from the accusation and worked backward, trying to disassemble what had been constructed against you. What Soren had built started from the truth and worked forward, each piece of evidence generating the next, the whole structure self-supporting and self-evident in a way that did not require a lawyer's interpretation to understand. You could read it the way you read a timeline. The timeline simply told you what happened and when and who was in the room. The judge was a woman named Honorable Celeste Okafor, in her late 50s, sharp-eyed, with the quality of attention that comes from 2 decades of listening to people say things in rooms designed for truth-telling while hiding the actual truth. She reviewed the petition summary. She reviewed the respondent's preliminary filing. She looked at the exhibit list. She paused on the exhibit list. It was longer than she expected. "Petitioner," she said. "Opening statement." The lead attorney rose. He was polished. He was prepared. He built the narrative the way it had been designed, 11 days of infant distress, for specialist departures, elevated staff turnover, pheromone instability documented through standard behavioral observation. He spoke in the measured cadence of someone presenting facts that he believed required no interpretation. He was presenting a picture, and the picture was clear. An alpha who could not stabilize his own household. An alpha whose children responded to his presence with consistent, documented distress. An alpha whose domestic environment had, by every observable standard, failed. He sat down. Judge Okafor wrote something on her notepad. Respondent. Avery stood. She did not open with an argument. She opened with a question. Your Honor, before we address the petition's claims about the respondent's fitness, I'd like to ask the court's permission to establish the environmental context in which all of the behaviors cited in this petition occurred, because the behaviors are real, and their cause is not what this petition suggests. The judge gestured for her to continue. Avery turned to Soren. He stood, carried his pedfolio to the evidence table that had been set up to the left of the witness position. He did not take the stand. The arrangement Avery had negotiated allowed for specialist evidence presentation from the floor, as his communication was documented as nonverbal, and the court had agreed to accommodate accordingly. He opened the pedfolio, and he began. Page 1 of the log, timestamps, intensity ratings, personnel grid. He placed it on the table where the judge could see it and where the petitioner's team could not easily interrupt it with objection because there was nothing in a handwritten log to object to except its accuracy. The petitioner's lead attorney tried anyway. Objection, Your Honor. This is unverified personal documentation. It's about to be verified, Avery said pleasantly. Give us a moment. She placed the independent lab report beside the log. Then the thermal imaging captures. Then the access records showing Vittorio Hale's visits to the nursery, timestamps, durations, the east wall positioning visible in both thermal frames. Then the sealed evidence bag chain of custody documentation, including the lab's own intake receipt. Then the Shell firm audit trail. Then the compliance hold notifications, dated and filed through federal channels. Then the security intercept log, showing the legal firm portal access from an IP address associated with Vittorio Hale's private consulting server, timestamped 41 hours before this hearing. The petitioner's team had stopped writing. Soren placed each document in order, deliberately, without hurry. He was not performing urgency. He did not need to. The evidence performed its own urgency piece by piece, each one connecting to the next in a chain that the opposing team could see assembling in real time and could not find a place to break. The The prosecution expected emotional instability. They had brought their arguments for emotional instability. They had not prepared for a chemical analysis report, a thermal imaging archive, a forensic audit trail, and a federal compliance record. Judge Okafor had stopped writing on her notepad. She was reading. She read the lab report in full. She reviewed the thermal captures twice. She asked one question, addressed to Avery, who related to Soren in writing, about the chain of custody for the ventilation swab. Soren wrote back 2 sentences describing the collection method, the sealing protocol, and the lab intake documentation. Avery read his answer aloud. Judge Okafor looked at Soren for a moment. Then she looked at the petitioner's table. "Counsel," she said, "do you have any evidence that disputes the chemical analysis findings?" Silence. "Do you have any evidence that disputes the thermal imaging documentation?" More silence. "Do you have any evidence that disputes the audit trail linking the Shell consulting firm to the expenditures documented in Exhibit 7? The lead attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we were not made aware of this evidence prior to. The disclosure timeline is not at question here." Judge Okafor set her pen down. "What is at question is whether the conditions documented in this petition reflect the respondent's fitness as a caregiver or reflect an act of deliberate environmental interference conducted by a third party for the purpose of manufacturing the appearance of that unfitness." She looked at the exhibit table. She looked at Demarion. "Based on the evidence presented," she said, "I am suspending the petition pending criminal investigation into the conduct documented in Exhibits 4 through 9. The fitness question is moot until the court can assess the environment in its uncompromised state." She paused. "I am also referring the matter of the legal portal access, Exhibit 10, to the court's Ethics Committee for review of possible improper filing conduct." She picked up her pen. "Proceedings suspended. Criminal referral to be filed by end of business today." She stood. The room stood with her. And then, without applause, without the cinematic swell of vindication, without any of the things that dramatic moments in movies provide as relief, the hearing simply ended. People gathered papers. Attorneys spoke in low voices to their clients. The fluorescent lights stayed exactly as bright as they had been. But the shape of the thing had changed. Demarion did not look at the petitioner's table. He looked at Avery, who nodded once. He looked at Soren, who was carefully closing his padfolio and placing his pen in the interior pocket of his jacket with the same deliberate patience he brought to everything. Outside the courtroom, in the marble hallway with the sound of foot traffic and distant elevators and the ordinary noise of a building full of ordinary business, Demarion stopped walking. He turned to Soren. He said, quietly, "Thank you." Soren looked at him, nodded once. Then he looked down at the padfolio under his arm and back up, and there was something in his face, not relief exactly, more like the specific quality of a person who has done the thing they needed to do and is now processing what it cost them to do it. Demarion did not press further. He simply walked beside him out of the building. By the time they reached the car, Vittoro Hale had been formally indicted. The indictment covered environmental interference, financial fraud through the Shell firm, and abuse of household access for malicious purpose. Demarion had watched the notification come through on his phone. He had not said anything about it. He had simply placed the phone back in his pocket and looked out the window at the city moving past. Later that same evening, he sent termination notices to 6 members of his executive circle whose financial disclosures had, under Avery's team's review, shown levels of knowledge that could not be explained by coincidence. Not loud, not theatrical. 6 letters. 6 meetings scheduled for the following morning. 6 careers in the Voss structure ended with the same quiet efficiency that had built the structure in the first place. The empire did not announce itself when it moved. Simply moved. Chapter 9. 3 weeks after the hearing, Demarion learned how to sign the word for milk. He was sitting on the floor of the nursery at 6:40 in the morning, which was not a posture anyone in his professional world would have recognized as his, with one twin in his lap and the other in the padded play space beside him, and he was watching a video on his phone with the sound turned low, replaying a hand motion he had gotten wrong 4 times in a row. The sign was simple. 2 fingers, curved, drawn down the palm. He got it wrong a fifth time. The twin in his lap made a sound that was not crying. A short, interested sound. She was looking at his hand. He tried again. She grabbed two of his fingers and held them, which did not help with the sign but did something else entirely that he was not prepared for, and he sat with it for a moment without moving. He had started the sign language 3 days after the hearing. Not because anyone asked. Not because Soren had suggested it. Because he had been walking past the utility room and heard, or not heard more accurately, the particular quality of a conversation happening without sound, and he had stopped and looked through the half-open door and watched Soren communicate something to the household coordinator through 3 gestures and a written line that had taken 30 seconds and carried more precision than most verbal exchanges he witnessed in boardrooms. He had stood in the hallway and thought, that is a language, and he had not learned it. He signed up for a remote ASL course that same evening. He was not good at it yet. That was fine. He had not been good at logistics when he started either. He had been someone who made mistakes and corrected them and made different mistakes and corrected those too, until the language of it became something his hands knew without being told. He was willing to do that again. He had just needed to understand that this was a language worth learning. Soren had given him that not by suggesting it, not by leaving resources, but simply by being fluent in it in front of him and letting the fluency speak for itself. Some things teach by existing. That was something Demarion was learning slowly, that not every lesson arrived as instruction. Some of them arrived as presence. As the simple, repeated visibility of someone doing something so naturally and completely that the person watching them understood, without being told, that they had been missing it. The mornings had changed shape. That was the simplest way to describe what had happened in the 3 weeks since the hearing, since the compounds had cleared from the nursery air, since the indictment had moved Vittoro out of the structure and the executive circle had been reduced to people whose loyalty was confirmed rather than assumed. The house breathed differently. Staff moved at normal pace. No shortened conversations, no strategic invisibility, no earbuds worn as emotional armor against a sound that never stopped. The overnight rotations had stabilized. 2 of the 3 housekeepers who had left during the crisis had returned, which Demarion had not asked for and had not expected, and which had told him something about the nature of a household that was functioning correctly versus one that was not. The twins were still infants, still loud, still entirely dependent and completely unreasonable in the way that all infants were. But the specific, sustained, biologically driven distress, the crying that had lived in the walls like a frequency, was gone. What replaced it was ordinary, manageable, the ordinary chaos of 2 small people becoming themselves in a space that was finally safe enough for that process to happen. Demarion changed both of them in the morning now. That had started the first week. He had asked Soren, via a note slipped under the utility room door, to show him the correct hold for the second twin while the first was being changed. A logistics problem, basically, which was the framing that made it approachable. Soren had shown him. Then he had stood nearby for 3 mornings without being asked, available if needed, not hovering. Then he had stopped standing nearby because it was no longer needed. The crib rail had a damaged hinge on the left side, something the overnight nurse had flagged twice in maintenance requests that had somehow not been acted on in the chaos of the previous weeks. Demarion fixed it himself on a Sunday afternoon with tools from the household maintenance kit, which took 40 minutes and 3 attempts and 1 moment where he sat back on his heels and looked at the repair work and thought, I am a man who controls port access for 11 cities. I just spent 40 minutes on a crib hinge, and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, that the crib hinge was more important. He was rearranging what mattered. Not loudly, not in a way that announced itself. Just the quiet internal reordering that happens when a crisis reveals, with the specificity that only real pressure can produce, what a person is actually built around. One morning, the second week, he found Soren in the nursery during the early afternoon. Not on scheduled shift, just present, sitting in the low chair beside the supply cabinet, doing nothing visible. Both twins were asleep. The room was quiet. Soren had a book open in his lap but wasn't reading it. He was just in the room. Demarion stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in, sat on the edge of the changing table, which was not a seat but held his weight. And they sat in the quiet together for a while, Two people in a room where the worst thing that had happened in this house had been centered, now just sitting in the version of it that the worst thing had been trying to prevent. Eventually Demarion said, without looking up, "You could have walked after the photograph." Soren did not respond immediately. He closed his book, looked at the cribs. Then he reached into the portfolio he kept with him and wrote, without hurry. Leaving would have been easier. It also would have been wrong. Demarion read it. "How do you know the difference?" he said. "Between the thing that's easier and the thing that's right. How do you hold that line when the easier thing is what everyone around you would understand and nobody would blame you for?" Soren thought about that. He wrote, "I learned early that what people understand and what's true are different rooms. I stopped trying to live in the first one." Demarion was quiet for a long time. "I misjudged you," he said finally. "When you were first hired, I looked at you and saw someone who didn't communicate, which I read as someone who wasn't fully present. I was wrong." Soren wrote, "Most people make that mistake. It's useful sometimes." There was something in that. Not bitterness, not performance, just the dry, clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who had lived long enough inside a misreading to understand its mechanics. Demarion almost smiled. Almost. He looked at the twins sleeping, then back at Soren. "Stay," he said, not as an employer, not as a command. The word had a different weight in it, the kind of weight that a word carries when it means something the speaker hasn't said all the way yet, and both people in the room know it. Soren looked at the word. Then he looked at Demarion, and he wrote nothing. But he did not close his portfolio. The rain came in off the river at midnight. Manhattan in February did this. Turned without warning, the sky dropping temperature and weight simultaneously, the glass towers along the waterfront running with water that moved in long, unbroken lines like something trying to get somewhere. The mansion on the upper block registered it as a change in ambient sound on the third floor. A soft, continuous percussion against the high windows. The kind of sound a house makes when it's been closed tight against the weather and everything inside it is still. Demarion stood at the window of the war room. He was not reviewing documents, not on a call, not preparing for anything. He was simply standing at the window in the dark, watching the rain move down the glass, and letting himself exist in a room without a task for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember. The empire was still there. That had not changed. The port contracts still ran. The board had reconvened, smaller now, quieter, with the particular quality of a room that has had something removed from it and is still adjusting to the changed air. The compliance investigations were ongoing. The indictment against Vittoro was moving through its process with the slow, grinding inevitability of institutional justice. The 6 executives who had been terminated were gone. Their replacements were being vetted by a process that Avery Blanchard had helped design and that Demarion trusted in a way he had not trusted the previous process. The structure held. That was the thing. After everything, the 11 days, the compounds, the custody petition, the courtroom, the quiet dismantling of an internal architecture that had been built against him, the structure held. Not because it was invulnerable. Because someone who should not have cared about it chose to care about it anyway. And because, for once, the person with the power had been willing to pick up what that someone put on the table instead of looking past it. Demarion turned from the window. He walked to the end of the war room. He stood in the corridor outside it, the corridor that ran from the war room on the east side to the nursery wing on the west. The hallway that bisected the 2 versions of his life. He stood at the exact center of it. Empire on one side, soft breathing on the other. He had stood here before in the worst weeks of his life and gone the wrong direction, back into the war room, back into strategy, back into the familiar architecture of control because the nursery felt like a problem he could not solve and the war room felt like the only place he could. He did not make that mistake tonight. He walked toward the nursery. The door was partially open. The nightlight inside threw a low amber wash across the room. Across the cribs, across the repaired rail, across the ventilation panel on the east wall that now held nothing but air. Both twins were sleeping. He could see the rise and fall of them from the doorway, the small, serious business of their chests doing what chests do when everything in the environment is telling them that the world is safe enough for sleep. He pushed the door open the rest of the way. Soren was in the low chair beside the supply cabinet. Not on duty. Just there, in the same way he had been there on the afternoon Demarion had found him during the second week, present in the room because the room was worth being present in. His portfolio was on his knees. He was writing something or had been. The pen was capped, the book still open, his eyes moving between the page and the twins in the way of a person whose attention was divided between two things they found equally worth watching. He looked up when Demarion entered. Neither of them said anything. Or, one of them didn't say anything, and the other stood in the doorway of his own nursery in the middle of a February rain and looked at a man who had chosen, repeatedly and without being asked, to stay. Demarion crossed the room. He stopped in front of the chair. He extended his hand. Not as a command. Not as an employer extending a gesture of gratitude that the employee understood as social obligation. Not in the way power usually extended itself, expectant, already certain of what it would receive. An invitation, his palm open, turned slightly upward. The same hand that had learned, badly and repeatedly, and with a patience he had not known he had, to sign two fingers curved down a palm for milk. The same hand that had spent 40 minutes on a crib rail hinge on a Sunday afternoon because the hinge needed fixing and he was the one standing in front of it. Soren looked at the hand. He looked at it for a long time. The rain moved against the windows. Both twins breathed. The amber nightlight held the room in the particular warmth of spaces that have been through something and come out the other side with their walls still standing. Soren's pen was still in his hand. He capped it. Set the portfolio on the floor beside the chair. He looked at Demarion's face, then back at the open hand. Then, slowly, with the specific quality of a person making a deliberate choice rather than a reflexive one, choosing the harder room over the easier one the way he had learned to do since he was 15, he reached out and touched his fingers to Demarion's palm. Not a grip, just contact. Fingertips to palm, light as a question, with all the weight of an answer. They stayed like that for one moment. One real, unguarded, unhurried moment with no strategy in it, no structure, no calculation of what it meant for the position of either of them in the architecture of the other's life. Just two people in a room where the worst thing had happened, choosing to be in it together now that the worst thing was over. Demarion's fingers closed, slowly, gently, around Soren's. Neither of them moved for a moment. Neither of them looked away. The room held them both in the particular stillness of a space that has been through the worst and come out with its air cleared, the kind of stillness that belongs to places that have earned their quiet. Demarion had spent 15 years building structures designed to last, contracts with teeth, systems with redundancies, relationships calibrated for function rather than feeling. He had been good at it. He had been, in many ways, defined by it, and none of it, not one pillar of it, had prepared him for this, the specific, unguarded weight of a moment that had no strategy in it, no calculation, no architecture of intent, just a hand, and someone choosing to take it. He thought, briefly, of the page Soren had written 9 days into an impossible situation. They deserved steady. 3 words that had cost more than they appeared to. 3 words that held in them the full weight of a person who had learned the difference between the easier room and the right room, and who kept choosing the right one even when the easier one was standing open with the lights already on. Recognition is more intimate than possession. Demarion understood that now in a way he had not understood it before, in his body, not just his reasoning. He had possessed a great many things. Buildings, contracts, access, influence. He had never once been recognized by any of them. Recognition moved in the opposite direction. It required someone to look at you clearly, without agenda, and see what was actually there rather than what was useful. Soren had looked at this house, at the crying, at the chaos, at the man standing helpless outside his own nursery in the dark, and had not seen a problem to manage or a position to leverage. He had seen something worth protecting. And he had protected it, page by page, in a notebook that nobody asked him to fill. That was the thing that mattered. Not the evidence. Not the hearing. Not the dismantling of Vittoro's structure or the compliance holds or the indictment. All of that had been necessary. None of it was the thing. The thing was a man in a utility room at 3 in the morning, writing down the time because the time mattered, because accuracy mattered, because two small people upstairs deserved someone who was paying close enough attention to notice what everyone else had missed. That was what Demarion's hand was holding, and he intended to hold it carefully. The rain kept moving down the glass, and so it began. If the story moved something in you, if you've ever watched someone stay when they had every reason to walk, or if you've been the person in the room that everyone looked past, drop your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be the one that inspires someone else today. This channel exists for stories like this one. Stories about quiet courage. About the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. About what it looks like when people choose steady over easy. If you want to be here for what comes next, subscribe and turn on your notifications right now, because the next story on this channel is already coming, and you do not want to miss it. Share this one with someone who needs to be reminded that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one who sees everything clearly. We'll see you in the next one.